the picture. An example is the old mill, in which we tried to take a picture to make the picture look as much as like Tenggren's styling sketches as we were able to. And here are some of his sketches of ducks for the old mill. A very innovative short. I highly recommend it. It's on Disney Plus. As if all those projects, which Tenggren worked on between 1936 and 1937, were not enough, Walt asked the artist to tackle several assignments in the publicity department, including the movie poster of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and the elaborate illustrations for the version of the story that appeared in the magazine Good Housekeeping. In early July 1937, Walt had asked Phil Dyke to recommend a member of the background staff who might handle that project, to which Dyke answered on July 9th, "I believe we are missing a bet if we don't have Tenggren handle the Snow White Good Housekeeping page. I have talked with the layout man, Tom Kodrick, and he realizes the need for a professional illustration job. With help we could give from the background department would not be skilled in the character painting nor the reproduction angle. We cannot afford to pull out our best men off backgrounds because of the pressure of work. Tenggren and Bill could, I feel, sandwich this in with what they are doing at the present time. That is, the color stuff." Tenggren took all these new assignments in stride. In fact, he seemed to have been so creative and so fast that one of his colleagues, Eric Larson, another one of Disney's 9 Old Men, mentioned that Tenggren felt that the other Disney artists moved too slowly for him. The aloof artist. As much as Tenggren poured his time and creativity into his work at the studio, he never really became part of the Disney team. He was not well liked as a man, confessed animator Frank Thomas, another one of Disney's 9 Old Men. Gus was a very quiet man, added his colleague Mel Shaw. He sat in his place there, and he did his little watercolor sketches for the backgrounds. He was very meticulous. He didn't talk much. He was the quiet type. And yet, despite his apparent Nordic aloofness, Gustaf did have a sense of fun. For a start, he played chess with animator Milt Kahl, another one of Disney's 9 Old Men, who shared his feelings of self-worth. And there were also stories of wild parties which shocked his most Puritan colleagues. Artists Jack Miller and Martin Provenson on Saturday evenings would have a model up at Gustaf's house, explained Joe Grant. And they'd all draw and drink. Martin, Jack, possibly James Bodrero, and a number of others around the studio. It would be quite a party. He'd have a nude model, and it was, I don't know, both esoteric and erotic. We were Puritans. Walt had a high moral sense. Most of us did. These guys were sensational. There was talk of a few strip poker parties. Bob Jones, another member of Joe Grant's character model department, remembered years later an evening he spent at the Tenggrens, which exemplifies how upsetting the Swede could be to some of his more straight-laced colleagues. "I had a very disturbing experience with Gustaf Tenggren. We turned out to be real good friends, and he invited my brother and me over to his house. So we went there. It was on Los Feliz, and he had this big apartment with north light. Beautiful. This room was about 30 feet long by 20 feet wide. A perfect art gallery type of thing. But it was his living room. And he had these big paintings. They were 3 by 4 feet, most of them, and they all were of this one model. Or I'd say 90% of them were one model. This very luscious lady, nude, and they were just beautiful paintings, all in different poses. They were all over the place. We were surrounded by them. And then he said, 'I'd like to have you meet my wife.' And she came in. She was a very lovely lady, and very obviously she was the one in the paintings. So we had a great dinner and just a delightful evening sitting around talking. But you'd be looking at her, and then you'd glance away, and then you'd have to look back. I couldn't wait until the evening was over. My brother and I practically fled from the place. I don't know if he did it for fun or not, but Bill said, "What do you think?" And I said, "That was the most miserable evening I've had in my life because it was so disturbing." But he was another remarkable artist. Did Gustaf realize how upsetting his behavior was to Bob and his brother? Probably not. He was clearly a stranger in a strange land. Pinocchio's masterpieces. By 1938, Tenggren was hard at work on Pinocchio, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and Bambi, three projects on which his impact was much greater than on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. On Pinocchio, every element of the movie was, in one way or another, influenced by his style, starting with the story itself. We couldn't really conceive of anything that would compete with Snow White, explained layout artist Ken Anderson. How could we possibly top that? It was Ben Sharpstein's idea to do Pinocchio. We weren't really sold on it at first, but eventually we did get sold on the idea. They invited Gustaf Tenggren, who had already worked on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, to come in and make key sketches, which he did, and we loved those sketches. He was a European, and those were things he knew as a boy. He knew those places. I started working with Tenggren and looking at his stuff. We wanted to make something better than we had with Snow White, so we needed to utilize all of our talent and everything we had to translate to the screen what Tenggren was doing. There was a big background of the city where Geppetto lived, with little houses and everything all over. It would fill the whole section of his living room, beautifully drawn. We had to plot how the camera would roam all over this background. When we photographed it, there would be no cuts. It'd just be moving all around all the time with the camera. It gave this wonderful picture of reality. Another layout artist, Ken O'Connor, was even more clearly inspired by and challenged by Tenggren's striking concept paintings. I was involved in laying out the sequence of the Red Lobster Inn where Gideon and Foulfellow meet with the coachman. Gustaf Tenggren did some terrific sketches of the alleys and the exterior of the inn, and I worked hard to get the feeling of his drawing into the layouts. I had this complex idea move laid out where the camera would go down an alley and around a corner and down to the inn. But it was getting too expensive in my thinking, and I had to condense it. I never did feel I caught as much of the flavor of Tenggren's sketches as I wanted to. Many years later, in a rare interview, Tenggren, looking at some of his concept paintings, recalled a few highlights of his work on Pinocchio. Walt Disney knew how to say no. The drawings would be torn up and a forest of new drawings would spring up in his face, and he would say no again, louder than before. Finally, of course, he must say yes. It would have to come to that in the end, or there would be no picture. Hold on a second.